Greta sat on the top of the hill, watching the sunset, when her phone suddenly rang. She picked it up, and her sister Lisa's number appeared on the screen. Greta quickly pressed the answer button. "Greta, are you there?" Lisa's voice sounded tense, with traces of panic. "Have you seen the news?" "I just went for a walk. What happened?" Greta asked, not suspecting anything wrong. "A fire. A huge fire. The whole area where we live. They're already evacuating people. You need to leave now." Lisa was literally shouting into the phone. Greta furrowed her brows, feeling her heart tighten from the unsettling news. She knew that wildfires were common in California, but she never thought it could get so close to her home. "I'll figure it out." "Don't worry," Greta replied, gathering all her belongings that were left after her recent divorce. She didn't have much time, so she packed only the essentials and headed out. The road to the exit was filled with smoky air, and the sky had turned an unnatural red. Greta quickly got into her car and headed towards the nearest road. Everything around her was covered in ash, and the trees, once green, now looked like black silhouettes against the red sky. Her thoughts switched to memories of life in this place. How long ago she and Lisa wandered along these same paths, now scorched by fire. Everything had seemed so peaceful back then. Now she was just praying it wasn't too late. Few could imagine how quickly nature's fury could destroy everything. She turned onto a side street when suddenly a loud explosion sounded. At first, she thought it might have been something with the car, but when she turned around, she saw the fire, like a living entity, quickly approaching. The fire was coming out of the forest that stretched far beyond the city. The wave of flames moved so fast that Greta didn't have time to react. She pressed the gas pedal, trying to escape the fiery ring that was closing in on her from all sides. After a few minutes, she managed to get onto the highway, and only then did Greta stop to check what had happened to others. One thought filled her mind: could she escape from what had already engulfed the whole area? Greta called Lisa again, but the phone didn't answer. She tried several times, becoming more and more anxious about her sister. Local news reported that people were being evacuated, but only a few routes remained to leave the city. The fire continued to rage. Its reflections were now reaching Greta, even on the highway. The smoke made it hard to breathe, and the air had become so hot that Greta could literally feel her skin burning. Suddenly, her car began to stall. At first, Greta thought it was just an overheated engine, but when she saw smoke coming from under the hood, her heart nearly stopped. "No, not now," she shouted into the emptiness. The choice was simple: leave the car and run to the nearest shelter, or stay and try to help somehow. But how could she help when everything around was burning? Greta made her choice instantly. She headed towards the nearest forest road, knowing it might be her only salvation. But with every step, every breath, she felt the sense of impending disaster grow stronger. And then something happened that she didn't expect. Greta ran quickly, barely keeping her balance due to the hellish heat pouring out of the forest. Smoke clung to everything around her like a huge cloud, absorbing all the light. She could hear the hoarse sounds of explosions and the fire burning everything she had once known. The city, the forest, the houses, all her memories, everything was under threat. With each step, she felt her strength fading. But there was nowhere left to run. The fire was getting closer. The smoke was so thick that it was almost impossible to tell where the ground ended and the sky began. She could see nothing except for this black, moving wall of flames. And then, at a crossroads, she came across the remains of a car. It was empty, but nearby stood a large bottle of water, mostly still full. Greta grabbed it without hesitation and took a deep gulp, which somewhat quenched her terrible thirst. Her thoughts involuntarily turned to Lisa. Where was she? How was she? Greta was determined, and her sister meant everything to her. She couldn't just give up. She moved on, crossing a field that had already begun to catch fire. The grass was blazing, and the flames quickly engulfed everything around her. But ahead, she noticed the low outlines of buildings, the old farm she had known since childhood. It was one of those places where all the family gatherings used to happen. Running up to the house, Greta noticed that the doors were open. She cautiously entered, searching for Lisa or any kind of help. Inside, everything looked strange. Though the house was empty, the air was filled with the smell of burning wood. In the corner stood an old chair, with burnt clothing on it and a sack of food that might have been left behind during an evacuation. Lisa. Greta whispered softly, moving through the dark rooms. Her voice sounded oddly hollow, as if it was an echo from another world. She reached the old cellar, and suddenly, she heard a strange sound. At first, it was a quiet, almost imperceptible noise, but with each passing second, it grew louder. Greta clenched her fists, listening to the sounds coming from below. She started to descend, where the darkness grew thick, like a black sea, swallowing her. As soon as she had gone down a few steps, a flash of fire erupted in front of her, the result of the blaze that had already begun to consume the foundation of the building. And then she saw it, pale light emanating from under one of the stone blocks. Getting closer, Greta realized it wasn't just light. It was something else. Lisa, she called out again, but her voice was once again lost in the fog. Greta bent down and removed one of the stones. Under it was another, and another. Suddenly, she saw that beneath the stone lay a creepy old coffee table, from which strange red marks were emerging. She tried to make sense of what this was, but her heart refused to listen to her instincts. Deep in the dark cellar, she realized she had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than just a fire. This place was abandoned, but the remnants of old newspapers and letters suggested that not everything here had been simple for a long time. Greta knew that this farm had long been under the control of local entrepreneurs, and that some of them didn't just keep their businesses in check, they seemed to have their own secrets. And it was here, in this dark cellar, that Greta suddenly realized she wasn't alone. Someone else was here. And that someone was closer than she thought. Greta froze when she heard a faint creak, like old doors opening. She immediately turned around, her heart racing. And then, silence. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, brought on by stress and fear. But then she heard distinct footsteps. Light, but confident. "Who's there?" Her voice was barely audible, almost lost in the fog that filled the cellar. There was no answer. The footsteps kept getting closer, and without thinking, Greta grabbed the first heavy object within reach. It was a chainsaw, left by someone on an old shelf. She raised it, filled with fear, ready to defend herself. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness. The figure was blurry at first, looking like a shadow dissolving, but the closer it came, the clearer it became. It was a person. It approached quickly, and Greta could only make out its blurred outline through the thick smoke. "Lisa," she asked again, even though she knew it was unlikely to be her sister. No answer. Only the echo of her words bounced off the cellar walls. Then, the figure stopped, and a red light glowed in the darkness, resembling the reflection of burning eyes. Greta took a step back, not taking her eyes off this strange and frightening image. "Who are you?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm, though inside, panic was burning. The figure didn't respond, but there was something strange in its movements. It looked human, yet with something that prevented it from being entirely real. Some invisible barrier obstructed its full form. And then, right before Greta's eyes, the figure seemed to melt, and another shape appeared. Clearly visible now was a wall blocking part of the cellar. Behind several old crates was an opening, where shadows moved. And sounds, like heavy breathing, could be heard. Greta felt a chill run through her bones. Her eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and she realized that behind the shadows stood people. There were several of them. They all shared one trait, bright red, burning eyes, which seemed to glow in the dark like symbols of something unbearable and evil. They didn't move, just stood, staring at her. "What do you want?" Greta asked, feeling her hands start to tremble. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she could barely breathe. There was no answer, but the figures began to move closer, stepping forward, and with each step, she felt the pressure of an invisible fear closing in. Suddenly, one of the figures took a step forward, and Greta saw its body start to look blurry, as though made of parts that didn't quite fit together. She raised the chainsaw, ready to attack, as the figure came closer. "Sorry." Its voice was calm, but there was a sinister undertone. Greta felt all her internal organs try to stop her. She knew this wasn't human, but the fear was so overwhelming that she couldn't move. The figure seemed to simply vanish. Then, once again, the red light flashed, and behind her, Greta saw Lisa. She stood there, silently watching her, with a sad smile on her face. But something was wrong. "Lisa. Are you alive?" Greta shouted, running toward her sister, but then her eyes widened in horror. Lisa's face began to change, losing its human form, covered in cracks that seemed to threaten to pull her figure into a black abyss. And then she realized, this wasn't Lisa. It was a ghost conjured by the fire. All those shadows, all those figures, they were the result of the cursed fire that wouldn't let go, even after death. Greta took one last step back and started running. She had to escape, leave this place where the cursed fire still lived on, taking everything that was precious. She could hear the dark creature drawing nearer, the sound of terrible footsteps following her. But would she truly escape? Was it already too late? Greta ran as fast as she could, but it seemed like the footsteps behind her were getting closer and closer. She could no longer navigate this dark, burned world. The forest was no longer a forest, but a shapeless ocean of flames, consuming everything in its path. At the end of the tunnel, it seemed like a bright beam appeared. In reality, it was the cellar door leading to the wasteland left after the catastrophe. However, as she got closer to the door, a strong gust of wind filled with ash slammed it back shut. "No!" Greta cried out, unable to believe what had happened. She was so close to salvation but had once again gotten stuck. The shadow behind her kept approaching, getting closer and closer. She felt something cold on her skin, gradually enveloping her like a charred finger. Her body began to freeze. She couldn't run, couldn't move, and realized that there seemed to be nowhere left to go. "I'm sorry." A voice barely discernible in the roar of the fire whispered. The shadow drew closer to her, and it seemed to absorb the last remnants of her strength. This wasn't just fear, this was the end. And then, in that final moment, she remembered all the important moments of her life, the moment when she first saw Lisa, when they laughed together, when they shared secrets and dreams. All of it, like scenes from a movie, flashed through her mind, and at that very moment, the fire surrounding her seemed to stop time. She felt she could breathe again. Greta summoned her last strength, turned sharply, and threw herself toward the open door, which suddenly swung wide. The fire stayed behind, but the mysterious figures chasing her didn't seem to let go so easily. She ran to where the forest met the open field, the place left behind. And only when she took the final step did she realize that she had survived. But even after the darkness had passed, she felt the shadow within her that refused to retreat. The fire had not burned out. The fire remained in her heart, and its remnants now lived inside her, entwined with memories and fears that could never be forgotten. And who knows, perhaps this wasn't the true end. For in the shadow of that burning forest, she could still see a few indistinct silhouettes standing on the horizon. Maybe this wasn't the last night in California.